everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing saxophonist Kendra Wheeler, professor of saxophone at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Dr. Wheeler, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Owen. I'm really excited to be here. And let's get started.
My first question is, what are some of your musical specialties as a performer?
This is a very good question and a hard question. It's not often that I think of my musical specialties. We as musicians spend a lot of time in the space of what we can get better at. So this for me is a little bit difficult, but it's a really great question. I'm really glad that you asked it. I think my ability to connect with the audience and create an inviting and intimate space is something that I'm good at and really important to me. There's a vulnerability in my playing that allows me to reveal part of myself in the music that I think is really special. Additionally, my ability to really focus on and create musical narrative in any piece that I'm playing, to essentially tell a story with every piece. And I would also say my sound concept, while my sound concept will continuously evolve as all of our sound concepts will. I think at this point, I am very pleased with where my sound concept is and what I've cultivated thus far. And I feel like it's authentically me, that when I listen to recordings that I sound like me, and I feel really good about that. And again, I know this will evolve as I listen to more music and just get older and go through life. But currently, I'm really, really happy and satisfied and think it's a nice musical specialty of my playing.
That's a great answer. I think we talk a lot about sound concept, especially as classical saxophonists. How would you describe your own personal sound and kind of what you're thinking about, maybe embouchure or voicing wise, while you are playing?
Yes, of course. I think when I listen to myself, the words or the imagery that comes to mind is very round, robust. I think it fills up the space that I'm in, any space that I'm in. Dark, of course, is another word that I know a lot of us like to use with a little bit of brightness in there. I don't think it's too dark or too heavy that it's dull. So I think it has a nice combination of warmth and darkness with a tinge of brightness that helps with projection and just, of course, not getting too heavy with the sound concept. But for me, it's like a warm hug sometimes, which I really enjoy, but can change according to the demands of the music or the style that may be needed of me. So how I cultivate that, a lot of listening, I grew up with a lot of music that was not classical music. So for me, a lot of my sound concept actually comes from non-classical players initially. I listened to a lot of jazz, smooth jazz was in my house a lot of the time. So I have these ideas of saxophone sound that come from all over. And one of the first saxophonists that I listened to was Eugene Rousseau. And then I also studied with Eugene. So I think I am a culprit of, as we all are, teachers that we've studied with, players that we hear, saxophone and non-saxophone related. And fundamentally, how I might achieve that. I mean, I play around a lot with syllable, as I think a lot of us do. So how we're conceiving of maybe ah or o or eu. I think I use a combination of these vowels. It's never just one, as many of us do. And as we change register or volume, these things will also change. But I like to find a syllable that allows me to keep that warm hug kind of feeling that just takes up the space, but maybe makes you feel like I don't know, pumpkin spice or cinnamon, something fall, so these warm feelings is what I think of, when I listen to myself. So
That's a great answer. I think I really appreciate that you brought up a dark round sound with some brightness, or sometimes I like to say edge to the
mhm,
sound, that helps with clarity and projection. It's something I've learned, especially playing tenor in a quartet,
mhm,
where it's really hard to cut through the texture. If you have a solo line or if you're just getting lost in the balance in general. And so that's something
mhm.
I've really had to experiment with. I
Okay.
think that we talk so much about playing with a dark sound, and that this idea dominates the conversation so much that we don't touch enough on that clarity and letting the brightness and focus kind of seep into the sound. And you were talking a bit about your earlier influence in saxophone playing, Eugene Rousseau, etc. I'm interested. What got you interested in concert saxophone?
Well, as I just mentioned, this is the question that I get a lot from my parents and family because I grew up in a household with all types of music, blues, jazz, smooth jazz, R&B, soul, funk, all these things. But the thing that you probably wouldn't find was classical music, let alone classical saxophone. And still to this day, I do get this question of, how did this happen? Well, when I was in high school, my sophomore year was the first year that I was, I think, truly exposed to concert saxophone beyond our solo and ensemble excerpts and things that we would play when we were younger. And my private lesson teacher at the time, Sean Tracy, my late private lesson teacher, Sean Tracy, who just passed away, I owe a lot of my musical career and passion to this person. I'm very, very thankful for him. He was an amazing saxophonist and musician and teacher. He, when I first started taking lessons with him, told me that I had to start listening to classical saxophone, that I need to get in this world, develop my sound concept, and understand what it's about. One of the first CDs he gave me to listen to was a Eugene Rousseau CD. I think it's called Saxophone Concertos CD, where he just records saxophone concertos. And of that, one of the first things, and I think the only thing at the time I listened to was Dubois, the Dubois Saxophone Concerto, specifically that first movement. And so I heard this in young high school sophomore. Kendra took off with that. I was like, yeah, I want to play this. This is great. I want to do this cadenza. I want to learn how to do all these things. And since then, I never looked back. So it really came down to a relationship that I had with my private lesson teacher who had trusted this person and gave me the CD and just never looked back after that.
That's a great story. Yeah, I still remember when I first discovered the Glazunov concerto. A college undergrad saxophonist in my area sent me a link to the Glazunov, and I had never heard saxophone played like that before. It was Londex's recording
Hmm.
of the Glazunov, and I was just intrigued from there. And I got more and more serious throughout high school. But yeah, it's very interesting how just one experience like that can kind of jumpstart your, interest.
Absolutely. It's really special. And it's nice that we can keep those in our memories. And sometimes I just think about that moment and I go back to when I'm thinking about maybe stress or, trying to figure out what is it that I'm trying to do at this moment? What are my goals? What do I want to achieve? It's nice to reflect on that moment that kind of put me into this position, into this field with this track. And it's really nice.
Awesome. Well, my next question is, what are some common problems that you see in saxophone students regarding articulation?
Of course, articulation. I think one of the big things that I've discovered is which is normal, a disconnect between the ears and the body. What they want to hear, the sounds that they want to hear, they're not yet familiar with the different color palettes or sound palettes of articulation, the different types of articulations that exist. And they also don't understand what may be happening physically when we articulate. What does it mean to articulate? What's happening with our airstream? What part of the tongue is making contact with the reed? How is the tongue moving in the mouth? What other things may be happening as you do this motion? So essentially, for me, I think it boils down to these kind of two big things is what sounds do you want to achieve with the articulation? And then how to achieve that thing by really becoming more intimate with the body and the anatomy and what's happening inside of the oral cavity, which we can't see, of course, when we play. So I think that wall is initially hard. And something that I've found is that when I start asking students what syllables or what kind of sounds can you describe the sound of the articulation that you want to have, or what's happening with your tongue, or what part of the tongue is making contact with what part of the reed, there's a blank. They draw a blank sometimes of, oh, well, I don't know. I've never thought about that. Or, should I be thinking about that? And I think absolutely. So one of the, not even a problem, I think it's just familiarity, really helping students to become familiar and intimate with their body, what's happening physically, as well as allowing them to explore and articulate or sing, listen to the different types of articulations as present. Um, and I think once those two things come together, articulation is no longer a mystery nor difficult, but we all have different physical needs. So it's just meeting the student where they're at and not trying to change too much about their anatomy because it's a specific way we think, but working with what they have and producing the sound concept that is needed of the music or the style or the genre that's in front of them.
That's a brilliant answer. I think, from student to student, often we're talking a lot about gear and reed strength and break-in of reeds, etc. And I think not enough about these, intricacies of embouchure and articulation and voicing and how interrelated they are and how much of a balancing act they are. Like you said, like the syllabic position of your tongue and also a proper articulation placement of the tongue on the reed. For a beginning player, those things can be kind of mutually exclusive. Like tonguing often disrupts younger players' voicing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. Thinking back to when you were a younger student and listening to younger students, like
Mm-hmm.
I was never thinking, when I was in eighth or ninth grade that when I articulated, the back of my tongue was probably also moving, and that
Mm-hmm.
was disrupting kind of probably my range, the quality of the sound,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And it we don't always think about how much of a balancing act all of these things are.
Of course. Yeah. And it's a lot to think about, right? And I think that we can meet students wherever they are at, not only age wise, but ability wise, and we can address these things maybe without using so many technical words too for working with a younger player. There's a way to go about developing these things without maybe getting too analytical. But for the students that want that, or the older students that may be at that level to have that, then definitely, letting them, exposing them to more of the technicalities and really getting familiar with these words and this language and all these abstract words we use to describe things as well. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's definitely meet the student where they are at and really just open their ears to the possibilities and then develop their relationship with their body, their anatomy, and what's happening.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think, I'm very much in that, college student bubble right now where we're getting all of these, words thrown at us. But yeah, it's always good to think back on, what it was like when I was a younger player and what it would be like to teach a younger player,
Of
without
course.
using all those, words like voicing and, all those syllables and, etc. But yeah, no, that's a great answer. And let's see. So my next question, now away from articulation, has to do with more with intonation.
Mhm.
Do you ask that students practice with drones? If so, what are some of the benefits and results that come from drone work?
Yes, of course. And I feel like, period, like yes, drone work. But I think maybe we don't always spend enough time talking about the why. And something that's really important to me as a teacher, and also just as a curious person and musician is the why. Why do we need to do these things? What exactly are we working on when we do them? So that I then feel more motivation to do that thing. And I think, a lot of students are that way as well, curious, which is great. But yes, drone work, I think is very, very important. It's necessary when we think about developing ourselves as total musicians, great musicians, being able to play in any style, any genre, and with any person, especially when we are considering tonal music. Not that intonation is not important outside of the tonal music realm, but if we are thinking about tonal music and the tendencies of certain chord qualities and intervals, we do want to make sure that we're able to play within that realm, within those requirements, and drone work is something that helps us do that. It is key to our development of understanding what is in tune, what is out of tune, what may be deemed sharp or flat. It also allows us to play in a multitude of contexts. So with a number of different pianos, we can adapt. We learn to adapt better when we are playing with drones. We also understand ourselves and our instruments better. So what is your tendency when you're really, really soft in the upper register? What is your tendency when you are really, really loud in the lower register or the middle part of the horn? How does your instrument react to the way that you play that instrument? Drone work is essential to learning ourselves, learning the instrument, and developing our ears so that we can be the most flexible musicians possible. So yes, 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 drone work. It is a requirement with scales, with certain etudes, trusting your ears in the process to adapt. So eventually moving away from looking solely at a tuner while doing drone work to really understanding what's happening, trying to process in real time and adjust in real time. Because really that's the name of the game, the adjustment in real time. Not everything will be perfect. Not every situation will be perfect. We won't always have the ideal circumstances, maybe to warm up before a performance or a gig. So we just have to be able to adapt. And I think drone work is very key, very essential to total musicianship, complete musicianship, being our best selves in any performance situation.
That's a great answer. Yeah, I've done a lot of drone work myself, and I've found it to be one of the most informative um, practice methods that I've used. And I think, um, I think it's invaluable because, when you listen to a string quartet or a saxophone quartet or a solo string player or a vocalist,
Mhm.
one of the things that differentiates a seasoned, player, a seasoned singer from somebody who is earlier along is pitch. Because
Mhm.
it's like we're typically only playing, saxophone almost always one note at a time, strings
Mhm.
sometimes two or three at a time, sometimes
Mhm.
vocalists one at a time. So, that exactness is very important to, I think audience members, even ones who aren't all that familiar with music and with pitch, they can still tell.
Mhm.
It's not like a fixed instrument like equal tempered instrument like the piano where it's like the
Mhm.
pieces get harder and harder, and if you play all the notes and you play some really flashy piece on the piano, people are like, wow, that sounded amazing. But like saxophone, you could play something really flashy, but if it's not in tune, people will still be kind of looking around funny
Of
and
course.
not totally sure what just happened. So
Of
I
course.
think for me, it, drone work has been one of the most informative uh, ways of practicing.
Much agreed. Same for myself. Still to this day, but also throughout my studies, you think you're doing something, and drone work is one of those things that reveals, oh, I have this tendency as a player. Oh, okay, this is not exactly right. And it's just a really, I think, humbling experience sometimes, but a very necessary one to, I think, all musicians' development. But yes, as single line players and players that spend a lot of time alone and not necessarily having the ability to play with others regularly or even play with piano regularly, thinking about some school systems where it's not so available to play with collaborative piano so that you can also start to adapt those skills. Yes, drone work is fundamental.
So my next question, and I always ask this one, this is like my favorite question, is how do you balance encouragement and criticism while helping a student reach their full potential as an artist?
Absolutely. This is a really great question. And I thank you for asking this. It's a difficult one too, in the sense that I think there are many factors, but not difficult because this is pedagogy, this is teaching, this is working with others. So for me, it's starting with who this person is in front of me, developing rapport, developing a relationship so that we can be honest with one another and then be honest with me as well to tell me, hey, this teaching style is not working, or I feel like I need more of this or less of this. I think this rapport is one of the ground, it's the ground level. It's a very fundamental part of teaching and pedagogy before we can even really talk about encouragement and criticism. So really seeing the person for who they are and developing a relationship. However, when we think about the nitty gritty of it, right? What we do, we spend a lot of time in critique mode, criticism mode, not only as teachers, getting feedback from students, but just as musicians, right? Every day we live in how to get better, how to be better, what do I need to do? So I think balancing those two things so that a student can really see their full potential is comes down to helping them, arming them with all the necessary tools so they can be their own best teachers and that they really learn to think for themselves. So I ask students a lot of questions. And my first go-to is not to tell them, oh, this could be better, this could be better, let's do this. It's, what did you hear? How did you feel about that? What did you notice? What did you observe? So that they start thinking in this mode for themselves. They start utilizing the skills that we've been building on their own. And then it's okay, yes, I agree. This is maybe something we can be better at. However, did you recognize the growth that you had in these areas? Or we've been working on this for weeks and this is getting so much better. This is excellent. Here's an area that I noticed we still need some improvement in, and or you're struggling with at this given time. But for me, it's really about them assessing in real time and listening to themselves and being honest with their progress and their feedback. So it's lots of questions, lots of collaboration, I would say, in the lesson. So some people will also describe the compliment sandwich, where you start with the things that are going well, and then we get into the nitty gritty, and then you end with that. I think that's also a very useful tool, something that I use a lot. But for me, something that I've noticed to be really, really helpful in my teaching for students to trust me and what I have to say and to trust themselves is giving them agency, helping them realize their agency in the learning process so that when they're in a practice room, they're at the gig, they're teaching future students, they are capable of doing that thing and they feel confident about it. Maybe they have a little Dr. Wheeler on their shoulder helping them through that, but they know how to process. So they gain a lot of confidence, and it becomes less about good, bad for me and more so about let's work on this thing together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm sure you know from your time with Professor Luloff as well that he's kind of he's a master of getting himself and
Mm-hmm.
projecting sort of a version of himself
Mm-hmm.
into the student's brain.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can already like feel it for the rest of my life. I know there's going to be somewhere in there, Professor
Or
Luloff is going to be saying, are you sure you want to phrase it like that? Maybe
yes,
try
okay.
this way, and um, and I think that's just a mark of great teaching is being able to leave something with the student, but ultimately open them up to discovering things for themselves. Because it's
Mm-hmm.
like, an undergrad only gets 4 years with you, and a master's student only gets two.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really the years after that that are going to count the most, I think.
Of course, I 100% agree, and I think you nailed it as well. And Professor Luloff is a master at that. And something that Eugene Rousseau also did in lessons was ask a lot of questions, and it's probably why I am the way I am. But it was you could phrase it that way, but you could also phrase it some way, another way. What are those other ways? Like really putting me in a position of, oh, this is my musicianship. This is how I want to do it. I don't have to phrase Creston one the same way that he might have. He really allowed for individuality. And I think that's a really special thing, especially when we think about the fact that we are working with people, and our job as, I think, teachers of any field, any discipline, is self-growth of the person in front of us, really making sure that this person can achieve their very best. But in order for them to achieve their very best, they have to know that they can do it. They have to have this sense of agency and confidence that they are gaining tools and structure. So, yeah, I think really just seeing the person for who they are helps balance encouragement and criticism very easily, because it then becomes about what here are the possibilities, what is your path, and let's help refine that path. Here are the ways that we can refine those things to make you and your musicianship really shine.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioned Rousseau talking about, you could phrase it that way, or, kind of giving you another option. I remember I had a lesson when I was still in high school with John Sampin, and he did something very similar. I think we were working on cadenza and the Glazunov. He basically he started kind of listing off recordings, including Rousseau's recording, and I think the catalyst for this was that it was clear I hadn't made up my mind on what my interpretation was as far as speeding up or slowing down or getting louder or keeping it the same tempo. It was clear I didn't have an idea of. So he was able to say, this player would slow down gradually. This player would speed up gradually.
Mhm.
Or you don't necessarily have to do either one of those. So he was giving me concrete examples to listen to and reference without telling me specifically which one was right,
Mhm.
which was pretty fascinating to me. And I've found jazz saxophone has also opened my ears and eyes to that. Well, it's interesting too. Jazz saxophone and classical saxophone, I think, both highly value recordings and reference recordings. I think classical saxophone more so than the rest of the classical community because a
Mhm.
lot of our repertoire is so new.
Right.
We don't have enough. We don't have the rich, performance practice and tradition that like a violinist would. So it's really important that we listen to the premiere recording of a new piece.
Mhm.
Um, but it's always kind of fun looking at different players. Like if I were to be studying Hank Mobley one week and then study Dexter Gordon the next week, it's like you realize they're both amazing, but they do things very differently.
Mhm.
And some of
Mhm.
they have certain strong suits in their playing, and they have certain weak points in their playing. They have things that they don't do, and things that they do very well.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's very freeing to compare these different great artists and realize like at some point you're just kind of going to wind up as yourself. And
That's the
um,
goal.
yeah, it's an interesting line to walk to with originality. I think we talk about originality a lot, but don't give enough context or instruction as far as how to get there. I think we talk too much about being original and not enough about emulating enough that you are
Mhm.
really truly learning the language.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
You have to, right? Yeah, I think you're like spot on. Originality for any context, classical or jazz, is not going to just come from thin air or out of the clouds, right? This is when we say originality, what we mean is finding a version of yourself. But before you can do that, you must look at the others around you. You must emulate. You must, it's like learning to speak, right? You're hearing all of these sounds. You will start to sound like the people that you are around, right? If they have an accent or they speak with a certain dialect from a certain region, we are always taking from others around us, which is what makes someone great. What is what makes individuals great is that we are a culmination of the things around us, and musicians definitely are. What we have to say is everything around us is part of what we have to say. How we show ourselves in a classical or jazz context, it doesn't just, you don't just wake up one day and decide this is how I'm going to be. It is a lifelong journey. So I think you're 100% correct. And the only other thing I will add to this too is that when we think about freedom and expression, something that I really enjoy talking about with predominantly jazz players who maybe have to cross over into classical either because of studies or are interested, and then classical players, predominantly classical players who are then breaching into jazz or want to do that, is this notion of freedom and expression. And I think largely when we think of jazz, we definitely think of freedom and expression, of being you, really finding your voice, saying what you want to say. And when we think of classical, I think broadly and generally, there's a box, right? That it has to be like this. It can't go any other way. And if it does, then you're completely, your ideas are completely thrown out. And at least that's the general idea that I've come across from students predominantly. And something that I really like to change, hopefully I would like to change in the future, is for more students to find their voice on the classical end because they understand that you can be who you want to be. You can say what you have to say. You can phrase that how you want to phrase it. Are there certain, parameters that we have to stay within as classical players? Perhaps, but there are parameters on the jazz side too, and that you can equally find your voice in the music and your expression, your individuality. Be free in both contexts, right? It's not just freedom here, but you can have freedom in all musical genres and styles.
Right. Yeah. I like to think of them a lot as styles and idioms. And I really like that point you're touching on with like the classical being kind of a box and the jazz seeming kind of, free. And it's like the more you look at both, the more you realize that there's classical music that's way outside of the box, and there's
Mhm.
jazz music that is very much rooted in the tradition and the idioms of jazz. Depending on the context, it is very much possible to play a wrong note at a jam session, which I am going to continue to learn the hard way over and over. And that's kind of part of the music. I think, the big thing that I'm realizing is they're very interrelated. It's just classical is predominantly written down and jazz is predominantly on recording. And
Mhm.
so it's just kind of different mediums that we're receiving the information through.
Exactly.
So I think that's one of the hard things, in terms of transitioning from one to the other, is the classical people, want it to be kind of written out for them, and then the jazz people want, you know, to be able to hear it before they, you know, look at it or sit down with it. So now that we've covered all the saxophone stuff, I have some just regular questions. So what do you like to do outside of music?
What? There's life outside of music? Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. I am a huge soccer fan or football fan to the rest of the world. That is not the United States, but I am a Liverpool football club fan through and through. So that's my favorite team. They play in the Premier League. So I watch a lot of the games. I just saw them. They were in Philadelphia, so I went to Philadelphia to see them. A little bit of a fanatic. When I was on the West Coast, I would wake up very early to watch some of those games, like absurdly early, but that's how much a fanatic I think I am. So soccer is a big one. Also playing as well, in addition to watching. I like to eat. I love food. I like to explore. So it's probably pretty fitting that I'm in Baton Rouge, which there's been no shortage of food for me to try these days. So I really like to eat. I like to explore new things, I like good food. And I also like music still, but outside of the things that I'm practicing or teaching, perhaps, I like listening to all sorts of other stuff, going to concerts, essentially just going out, being out, either at festivals if they're happening, live music. Yeah, just like hanging out. I mean, I also like to read and actually not do um, only music related things, but I also like reading. I like podcasts. I'm a true crime weirdo. I suppose I really like true crime podcasts and listening to them probably at the worst times, but I think the best times. And let's see here. I really enjoy TV as well. I like movies and I like TV shows. So a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know. I've been recently listening to a podcast called Criminal.
Mm,
It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. The main kind of commentator who runs the show is named Phoebe Judge. She's a journalist, and it's really, really well done. And they're not all necessarily like things that are illegal. They just have to do loosely with crime. I think most of the episodes involve something crime related, but
or,
there are
yeah.
some that are just like kind of weird coincidences or
Uh-huh.
just kind of um, something in a certain historical context that now would seem wrong, and it's super interesting the way it's done. But
Oh, I should
yeah,
check that out. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll definitely check that out. I like
yeah, and
stuff
then
like
yeah, I love TV as well. Love right now I'm watching the Pacific, which is really good. Rami Malek's in that one. Have you seen that?
I've not seen it. I know of it. I've not seen any episodes yet, but if you say it's good, I might try it. I
It's
might try
good.
it.
It's good. It's a tough watch, but I think it's important to like know, our country's history and
Yeah.
what the world was going through then in the
Yep.
40s and yeah, anyway. Then I'm also way into fishing, so and whenever I
Oh,
have free time, I'm always trying to get out to the water and
oh,
see
definitely.
what I can catch. So,
Really, there's no shortage of that for you where you're at right now, especially.
right,
Uh,
it's only an hour and 15 minutes to the Gulf and there's a lot of freshwater fishing around here. So, yeah,
wow, that's
yeah,
really cool.
it's gonna be a nice change of scenery once it
Yeah,
gets a little bit cooler.
I know, right.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal now.
I understand.
Well, cool. Um, and then oh yeah, I've got one more question.
Oh,
Um, outside of classical music, what kind of music do you like to listen to?
great question. Pretty much everything. I'm a huge hip hop fan, R&B fan. I really like old school R&B, I should say, like 90s R&B. I mean, I'm a 90s baby, so maybe I'm biased in that regard, but those are my jams. Also some soul, some gospel music too, because I did grow up in the church. I actually listen to a lot of jazz as well. Braxton Cook, Emmanuel Wilkinson. Like I'm deep in a lot of these sounds right now, but also have a huge soft spot. I always go back to Cannonball and of course Dexter and a lot of our standards. Um, there's not much that I don't listen to. Pop. I don't listen to a lot of country and I don't listen to a lot of metal. Um, but pretty much everything else I can pretty much hang with. So yeah, I like to explore. I love recommendations for things. Students would send me recommendations, and I'm usually pleasantly surprised about the stuff that I'm missing out there because there's so much. So yeah, I love all new stuff. If anyone has recommendations, please send them my way. I'm always down.
Right, yeah, I would agree, especially with the country. I don't listen to country, but I do really, really love bluegrass music.
Mm,
I'm,
hmm.
I've been listening to a lot of the Punch Brothers, and Chris Thiele, the front man for
Oh
that
yes,
group.
yes.
He's just does
He's
everything.
insane. Oh yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, that's been one of my favorite groups over the past year or so. And then I'm always listening to jazz and
Yeah.
classical music. That's just kind of my thing. So
Yeah.
our thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, living in those worlds for sure, for
Right.
sure.
Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 16 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Dr. Kendra Wheeler, professor of saxophone at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. Thank you for listening, and remember to practice smart and stay healthy.